Okay, I see that the speakers of this session have joined. So we have with us Professor Gulshan Sachdeva from the JNU. We've got Professor Till Berninghausen from University of Heidelberg. Also from University of Heidelberg is Professor Rahul Mukherjee. I think he will join us shortly. And we've got Dr. Tarun Jain, who's from the IIM in Ahmedabad. So as we move to this session, I would like to introduce the chair of this session, who is Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, and then he will take over the conversation from here. So Professor Sachdeva, as he's the chairperson and professor at the Center for European Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University here in New Delhi. He has been awarded the prestigious Jean Monnet Chair in European Economic Integration and Energy Security by the European Commission, has also been the editor-in-chief for a peer-reviewed journal published by Sage India called as International Studies. Earlier, he was the director of the Energy Studies Program and director of UGC Europe Studies Program, has been part of many Jean Monnet networks and also the Horizon 2020 training networks. I pass on the mic to you, Professor Sachdeva. You may begin with the session. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, so we are now starting this panel, national responses to pandemic and changing world order. Now, at the outset, let me first thank this German Center for Research and Innovation, DWIH, and its director, Dr. Katya Lash, for inviting me to moderate this panel. Now, we have a very solid panel with Professor Rahul Mukherjee, Professor Tarun Jain, and Professor Tin Berninghausen. The COVID-19 pandemic has obviously changed the world dramatically. As the pandemic is still unfolding, I think its full implications are difficult to predict, but already its health and economic impacts, and even to some extent political impacts, are clearly visible throughout the world. Even today, when we speak, I think we have about 500,000 infections in the world still every day. In India, we have about 35 to 40,000 infections happening even now. And even in Germany, we have about 10,000. But of course, there are also large-scale vaccination administration, which is happening. So over the world, I mean, all over the world, about roughly 30 million vaccines are administered every day. So in Germany, and in the overall, I think the EU, about 60 to 65% citizens have already vaccinated. In India, the absolute numbers are high, but about 40% people have got at least one vaccine, and about 12-13 people have been fully vaccinated. So there is a long way to go. And in other many developing countries, I think the percentage of people vaccinated is still pretty low. And it's also becoming clearer that the post-pandemic world is likely to be significantly different world altogether. Now, the shape of post-COVID Germany and India will depend on their handling of health crisis and also related economic difficulties. Now, the post-COVID-19 world I think is going to be different. The world was already in transition, but I think the world order was already in transition. But I think the pandemic has accelerated this change. The Western world, under the leadership of the United States, has already weakened. China is expanding and asserting. At the same time, I think suspicions about China are also growing. This may disrupt the centrality of China in global value chains. The multilateral institutions, including the WTO and WHO, are much less affected today. India, Germany, as well as the European Union, I think, believe in a democratic and multipolar world. They would also like to promote effective multilateralism. Broadly, if I can see the European Union, in which Germany is a very important member, and India are not seen as a threatening power by most countries in the world. Now, due to economic disruptions created by the pandemic, I think most sustainable development goals are now less likely to be achieved. As major players in the OECD, DAC, and South-South cooperation, respectively, I think both Germany and India can build an inclusive global development architecture. The Germany, along with the EU and other member states, have also been pioneer in climate change related issues. And Germany is also emerging as a leader in green technologies. India also has its own ambition in renewables. It's reflected through International Solar Alliance. So I think if we can bring together the capacities of European countries like Germany and India, a large number of other countries can also be attracted towards sustainable future. Now, coming together, I think they can bring capacities, experiences, and also legitimacy in the institutions of global governance. Both Germany and India have strong and complex ties with other major powers like the United States, Russia, China. Now, to be effective together, I think they must upgrade their policy coordination and mutual understanding about other players. Europe's faith in transatlantic alliance and India's hope from an alternative norm building through the BRICS is now low today. Therefore, to resolve, I think, many of the existing global challenges, Germany and India must start working together for a new institutional architecture for global governance. Now, ultimately, these kind of cooperation perhaps may lead to sustainable, rule-based order in the world. Now, to begin this session, we have Professor Rahul Mukherjee, who is a professor and head at the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg University. He's an old friend. I mean, we work together at the Center for Policy Research, as well as also at JNU for many years. He is one of the finest scholars on Indian political economy of Indian economic reforms. He is a senior non-resident fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and also co-chair of the China-India workshop at Fudan University in Shanghai. He also serves on the board of journals of many reputed journals, and he also co-edits a book series titled Institutions and Development in South Asia with OUP. And Professor Mukherjee has also co-authored with Professor Sumit Ganguly, India since 1980, which was published by the Cambridge University Press and also been translated in a couple of other languages. He is PhD from Columbia University. May I invite now Professor Rahul Mukherjee, an old friend. Professor Mukherjee. Rahul, we can't see. Rahul, you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Professor Mukherjee.
Can you upload my slides? Is it possible to upload the slides that I have just sent to Ms. Mehta, Ramneet Mehta?
Yeah, it's a PDF, just sharing the screen then. Yep.
I've also sent a PowerPoint slide. I thought it was a PowerPoint slide. Anyways, I think since time...
Professor Mukherjee, sorry, I am unable to share the screen right now. So probably you will have to share the PPT directly from your end.
Just 1 second. Let me... Technologically challenged.
It's probably because of the PDF format.
Yeah, so there's a share content There's a share content, and should be able to go to
Yes, we can
good,
see
good,
now.
good. Yeah. Great. So my presentation, this short presentation is divided into 3 portions. In the first portion, I will talk about why the infections rose and fell. In the second component, I will talk a little bit about vaccine diplomacy. And in the third component, I will talk a little bit about COVID-19 and Indian democracy. So I will be kind of brief and crisp because we have 10 minutes to do this all in, but brevity, they say, is the soul of wit, so it should work. My first proposition to you is that a lot of the research and much of the research that I'm presenting here today is co-authored material with my colleague, Dr. Syed Hussain Zarhani, who works with me at the Department of Political Science at Heidelberg University, suggest that the state succeeds when it deliberates, both within the political class as well as when the political class deliberates with the technical assets that the government has. When this deliberation between the political and the technical is lacking, oftentimes we find that there is a problem of governance. So if you look at the first slide, you will find that the first COVID-19 lockdown actually occurred on March 24th, 2020. On March 24th, 2020, when the lockdown occurred, people thought that this lockdown was going to solve India's problems. However, you find that the first wave actually took off sometime in June. And between March and June, it became very difficult for India to even keep up its lockdown. And if you have heard the news, you know that there was a great migration during this period of time, that a lot of people moved out of the metropolitan cities and went into local areas, spreading infections. So why did this happen? And I posit in a paper in the Journal of Democracy in 2020 and in some forthcoming publications that there was a lack of deliberation both within the political class as well as between the technical and the political. So there were a lot of people in the parliament who were saying that debates are required on how to deal with the COVID and how a lockdown should be done. There were substantial discussions about importing masks and things like that, but none about a lockdown before the 24th of March. And on the 24th of March 2020, the parliament just shut down. There was no deliberation. I can elaborate in the Q&A that there was medical advice available within the ICMR. There was a sero survey done which was kept secret. And all of this led to what some people have called, the Great Migration, which parallels the partition. There was also a lot of good technical advice available from economists that the economy should be boosted. None of this was adhered to, and we find that by September, October, there is the first wave. And then soon thereafter, you will find that there is a kind of dipping, and by about January, there is a lull. Now, at the time when there is a lull, once again, there was scientific advice that suggested that India had not attained herd immunity. There's an organization called INSACOG, which reported to the cabinet secretary, but India pretended as if it had fought the crisis and that it had almost all the vaccines that it needed. The result of this overconfidence, and I can elaborate on these issues, resulted in a situation where, despite warnings of former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, we find that the country was inadequately vaccinated, vaccines were not available, and some of the vaccines had been exported, and then we have this historic second wave. The historic second wave, paradoxically enough, killed a lot of people, even among the elite in Delhi. There are gory tales about how people died because of the lack of oxygen cylinder and hospital beds. I now want to say a few things about vaccine diplomacy without going into details. The two people you see in this slide are Adar Poonawalla of the Serum Institute of India and Krishna Ella of Bharat Biotech. Now, as you know, Mr. Poonawalla was supposed to be producing a lot of vaccines. He had connected with AstraZeneca, and then there is now enough evidence to suggest that the two major vaccine alliances of the world were expecting the Serum Institute of India to not only manufacture vaccines for India, but actually to support the rest of the developing world with vaccines. But what happened was that even though there was much financial support through the Bill and the Melinda Gates Foundation to the Serum Institute of India, such support was not forthcoming from the government. And on the contrary, a vaccine was supported through Bharat Biotech, which became some kind of a competitor to the Serum Institute vaccine and was touted to have been cleared even before the World Health Organization would agree. The result of all this, to cut the long story short, is a situation where in the liberal global order, whereas India, with its magnificent capacity to manufacture vaccine and vaccinate billions of people, could have come right on top of the world, we found that it was struggling with vaccinating its own population, despite a former Prime Minister having warned the health minister, saying that don't look at the total number of vaccines that you're delivering, but rather look at the proportion of the population that has been vaccinated. Had this vaccine capacity come true, there is reason to believe that the second wave may not have been very detrimental. And I have evidence to show that there was serious medical advice that was available to the government. The final point that I want to make in this short presentation is that COVID-19 has also made an impact on democratic politics in India. And the kind of impact that it has made follows the principle of centralization of governance in India, which are often beginning to attack the pluralist nature of India's civil society, as well as the pluralist nature of the Indian state. I don't have time enough to belabor the details, but I just want to point out certain things conceptually, which can be raised in the Q&A. This idea of centralization and lack of deliberation are being largely propagated through two mechanisms that historical institutionalists call drift and layering. Drift is a situation where formal rules and laws do not change, but the old rules can be interpreted in a way in which behavior can be changed. So formally, there is no change of rules, but in fact, there is a change in the way in which institutions interpret rules. And I would argue that some of the manifestations of this are curbing the media. No rules have changed, but look at what the VDEM is saying. Curbing protest, No rules have been changed, but Shaheen Bagh is over, and a large number of protesters find it very difficult to protest. The only exception, of course, are the farmers who are producing a historic event in the borders of Delhi. Then the manner in which India's fiscal federalism has been attacked, I would argue, using the COVID-19 situation, because the government has touted the COVID-19 situation as an act of God. And the manner in which states feel that they are losing their federal powers is a matter of concern. But no rules have been changed. Parliamentary conduct, especially during COVID-19, has been affected. The manner in which the farm bills were passed, for example, the manner in which the Foreign Currency Regulation Act was amended, are only two examples of the manner in which a plethora of bills are being passed without adequate consultation and without referring the bills to the standing committees. But this haste is the result of the parliament functioning for a very short period of time and having to do a lot of work. Of course, the lack of deliberation is an idea whose time seems to have come. Layering, of course, has happened, and this is a very long topic. One can argue that COVID-19 was used to pass the three farm bills that have become very controversial. The COVID-19 was also used to pass the Foreign Currency Regulation Act, which was amended in September 2020, again, in the same manner in which the farm bills were passed. So then I think to conclude, and because I'm sure there are other speakers who will elaborate on the economic dimensions and the health dimensions of the crisis, I will make these humble submissions to you and look forward to further conversations during this panel. Thank you very much, Professor Sachdeva, for giving me this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Now, I think you have, in a very brief presentation, thank you for keeping within those 10, 12 minutes. You have really raised a couple of fundamental points. One is that now we have all lived through what has happened in the last 2 years in India. One is obviously the way the first lockdown was implemented in India when there were only 100, 200 cases and the whole country was shut down for 2 months. And by the time actually you need lockdown, there was total fatigue, and then it became much more difficult to contain, and then it has. So there was but despite that, I think there was a overconfidence, as you have rightly mentioned, in the political elite. They have more or less, they thought that the way Europe has struggled, the way the America was struggling, India has somehow be able to tackle this issue, despite the fact that economy was very badly impacted compared to all other neighboring countries within South Asia and broader Asian context. But at the same time, the very important point you have made, perhaps later on we'll need more discussion, and I know you have authority on that, on how political elite has really used COVID-19 as an excuse for many other political projects, which are still happening. So how it has affected the institutions of governance in India, judiciary, and everything else. I mean, so very important point, but of course we also have very important issue of economic impact of that. Perhaps the next speaker would touch that. We'll come back to Professor Mukherjee, to you later on once the presentations are over. So now may I invite Professor Tarun Jain. He is Associate Professor of Economics at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He was also the faculty at the Indian School of Business, and his research is focused on understanding causes and consequences of human capital formation. He received funding for the research from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the International Growth Center, and International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. and he has also published in many peer-reviewed journals, and he is also a regular contributor to national dailies. He's PhD in economics from University of Virginia. Professor Tarun Jain, over to you, sir.
Okay, so I hope I'm clear. Am I audible? And is my
Yes,
comment
yes,
clear?
clear,
Okay,
and
great.
you can see your slide
So
also.
thank you so much to the center for inviting me, and thank you, Professor Sachdeva, for your kind words of introduction. I'm, very heartened to see the debate that is going on today, and particularly, the questions that Professor Rahul Mukherjee raised on the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, of course, as economists, we wrestle with those questions all the time, and to some extent, some of my presentation today is going to talk about some of those things, right? So, without much ado, let me just get into the sort of questions, what this pandemic has thrown up. And so I thought, what are some of the broader issues that many people, many social scientists have been grappling with. And so, here's just a small list of those issues. Right? So, the pandemic has wrought a lot of shutdowns, obviously, as containment measures, and those containment measures have come with economic disruptions. And so, for the Indian economy, those economic disruptions have been quite severe. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can measure and understand some of those economic disruptions that have taken place. Coupled with the internal lockdown and the internal disruption have also been global shocks. So we cannot travel anymore internationally all that easily, particularly last year when flights were basically ended. International trade has been impacted, partly because not only are we in India grappling with the economic shock of COVID-19, but our trading partners are as well. And so some of the impacts on these shocks have been particularly felt by vulnerable populations. One particularly shocking statistic from last year, right? Shocking statistic from last year is that it was the first time in almost like 40 years that hunger increased in India. So despite India's ups and downs, economic ups and downs, you have various measures of economic prosperity. But one thing which had always been improving was that the amount of food that Indian children and Indian families ate was always going up. And last year was the first year when we saw that reverse, and hunger came back in India for after a very long time. So, these shocks to vulnerable populations are particularly disruptive. In the previous session, we saw things like shocks to education sector. And I think, we'll be spending a lot of time recovering from the kind of impact that COVID-19 has had on our poorest and most vulnerable citizens. There's also a lot of I think microeconomics around topics of say diagnostics and containment. I mean, much of how to contain the COVID-19 pandemic has been around things like RT-PCR tests. Before 2 years back, I did not know what an RT-PCR test was, but today it is there in every conversation. There have been issues of vaccine development, deployment, and pricing. These are sort of top of the mind because who's going to pay for these vaccines? Is the government going to pay? Are private citizens going to pay? So on and so forth. And finally, health infrastructure, right? Are we going to allow private sector to invest much more? Is the government going to invest? Who are the personnel going to be financing? So on and so forth are some of the points that I think are quite important in this area. So just to give you a sense for what has been the impact of COVID-19. Here's this New York Times story from April last year. The lockdown leaves vast numbers stranded and hungry. You saw this play out in terms of the migrant crisis that Professor Mukherjee was talking about, right? And you also saw then the top line GDP number for the second quarter of 2020 was the second quarter of 2020, which is the first quarter of the fiscal, was down 24% decline in GDP. Right, so this is just massive indicator of lack of prosperity in India, lack of wealth, lack of income, and insofar that this has been concentrated amongst our most vulnerable citizens, I think this has been a real concern. Now, of course, the question is how much of this was because of government containment policies versus just something that was out of our control because of the virus, right? So we can take a look at some of this, right? So there is some research that we've been doing at IIM Ahmedabad along with our partners, right, which is trying to look at the impact of some of these containment measures that the government came up with, and try to see what was the economic impact of that. Now, the government of India, of course, many of you know, announced the world's most stringent lockdown, according to the Oxford University tracker, in April and May in April last year. This had extensive economic damage in various ways. But what is the impact of the pandemic containment measures apart from the infections, right? So what we started to do is to look at a unique experiment, national experiment that took place in May 2020, and which is this graded unlock period, right? So graded unlock, what we see is that the government divided the country into these zones, right? So every district was a different zone. There were some red zone districts where it was pretty much, lockdown as usual, severe lockdown. Orange districts had slightly more permissiveness, and green zones were almost back to business as normal, right, according to the government. And so this is a map of India, which shows you all the different districts where they had implemented the zonal strategy. And so you can see that these zones are sort of all over the place. And so now what we started to do is to try to look at how does economic growth vary in the green zone districts compared to the orange zone districts, red zone districts versus the red zone districts, right? And we are using as a measure of economic growth lights. So we are measuring using the satellites that circle the Earth, right? So these are NASA satellites. What they're doing is picking up on lights that are visible from space. And the nice thing about this is that the data collection by NASA satellites was not disrupted by the pandemic, whereas every other type of data collection here on Earth was disrupted. So we are using these night lights from satellites to measure economic growth. And so we're comparing the red zone districts to the green zone districts, and we're comparing the orange zone districts to the green zone districts. And so this is our finding, right? So I'm happy to share some of these in more detail if you like, is that the severe restrictions by the government led to a 7.2% greater decrease in GDP compared to the green zone districts and the red zone districts. And in the orange zone districts, GDP was 1.3% lower compared to the green zone districts. So, I mean, this is pointing to the fact that some of these containment measures had a real bite in terms of causing the disruption in many of these areas. Right? The impact of the government's containment measures was far more in economically more developed districts. So this means that your work from home measures, your digitization, they are not solving. They're not panaceas for all these containment measures that the government comes up with. And in some ways, these are all results from the first wave. So when the second wave came around, the government of India, the central government, was very reluctant to lock down in the second. And some of these, answers around the economic costs of containment measures are telling us why the government was so reluctant to do so. So our, speculation on this is that if ever there's a third wave, I hope not, that future containment will be very local because the government is very reluctant to come up with district-wide or blanket bans on economic activity, and instead the government will be telling us to learn to live with COVID-19. So the other kinds of interesting things that have been happening is that the government loves to intervene in various kinds of medical markets. Now, I think the broad strategy in most countries have been that the governments, the public health systems have taken a front role in both testing as well as vaccination. But in India, the government has been, curiously open to the private sector taking a leading role, but yet they want to intervene on things like pricing. So I think the diagnostics, the RT-PCR diagnostics industry is a nice example of how the government has intervened in specific markets associated with COVID-19. So as you might guess, that the COVID-19 pandemic led to an increase in the demand for testing, when at a time when the RT-PCR tests themselves were in short supply. Now, as a result of this, many private labs had increased the prices for RT-PCR tests. Responding to these increases in prices, the government implemented price caps in April 2020, saying that you cannot charge more than a certain amount than what you might, than what the government tells them to, right? So what happened as a result? Now, you might have thought that, the COVID-19 pandemic was a major opportunity for private sector to increase, invest in diagnostics. Today, there would be a massive diagnostics industry in India, but there's not. And so why is that the case? Well, here's the reason. Many of the large diagnostics labs did respond by, say, increasing testing, partly because they wanted to achieve economies of scale. They adhered to what the government was telling them in terms of implementing the price caps, but they did increase the quantity of the tests just to drive economies of scale, lower down their costs in order to still end up with a slight profit margin. But the large diagnostics labs really pushed much more on saying, okay, fine, we will adhere to the government's mandate on the RT-PCR test, but we'll also bundle in many more tests for all these COVID-19 positive cases, right? So the D-dimer test, the ILFC test, the CBC test, right? So if you go in, if you see COVID positive and get a price capped RT-PCR test, one of the things that the labs start to do is to add on multiple services. The lab said, okay, fine, we'll adhere to the government price cap in letter, but we'll also charge you for things like home collection, PPE kits, so on and so forth, started to pool samples. One big, I think, answer to why the diagnostics industry did not expand to the extent, because small diagnostics labs have basically sat this one out. And so even though this was a massive opportunity for many diagnostics labs to enter the market, the government price caps had the impact of basically wiping out profits for the industry, and therefore smaller labs did not enter this business. They did not invest, and so therefore the diagnostics industry has remained small. Right? I suspect that this will be the case for many other parts of the health sector as well. That private hospitals, the sector will be hesitant to take on risk, enter in an industry where the government will then circle back and tell them that, no, we're going to implement price caps, we're going to regulate you, and therefore wipe out your profits. So the private sector anticipates that, and therefore has chosen not to invest as much as it would have otherwise. So some final thoughts on this, before I run out of time. So, I think I view that the COVID pandemic was a massive political and economic opportunity to improve our health system. Right? Never in the last few decades has there been such a discussion around the quality of public health provided in India, and a consensus that high quality public health is critical to well-functioning democracy and well-functioning economy. The government could have expanded the public system. They could have engaged the private sector in a positive way rather than a purely transactory way. They could, there is changing population behavior towards health. I think many people are much more aware of infectious diseases and the, a demand to change their own behavior to deal with those diseases, and to adapt the public administration for those pandemic responses. I think there's a type of that, right? But curiously, that has not happened, and the government has been reluctant to engage with the public health sector in a significant way. I think the most telling aspect of this is that in the pandemic year union budget, the finance minister increased health expenditures by a grand total of 10%. And so, I think that is a little bit disheartening. But I remain an optimist. I hope that even if the government is not taking the lead on it, rest of civil society, the private sector, does invest, and that we will see successes in terms of investments in the future and better social economic. So thank you so much for this time and the platform to share my thoughts. I look forward to all your questions and queries and an engaging debate in the next time that we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tarun Jain. I think you made a couple of very important points. One, of course, is I think it was quite evident that as a result of COVID-19 pandemic, economy has been very badly hit. I mean, India hasn't seen this kind of recession in the last couple of decades. So that was quite evident. But the point is that also it's not just only economy has been hit, but the poor and most vulnerable section of the society has been, that's the one, they are really one who have been hit by this. And he also made the point that the hunger has increased I mean, this is the thing which we thought we have kind of resolved this issue in India, but many of those issues have come back. And but two other points which perhaps later on will come during discussions. One is, although I mean Indian economy is about 15, 16, 17%, comes from agriculture, but close to half the economy, half the people work in the agriculture sector. And this was the one sector where more or less everyone believed that this has been not so affected by all those kind of containment measures. So what really is happening in the agriculture sector on the rural areas, one has to really look into this. And the second thing is, although economy has really badly hit, and the poor obviously has been, the one, but the inequality has increased tremendously. That's what, in fact, many of the studies are showing. At the same time, share market sometimes is booming. Some of the large business houses, they are, showing all kind of profits. They haven't seen, we haven't seen those kind of things before. So what kind of, the churning is really happening? I mean, and then what kind of interventions the government is making and where it is going to lead us in the next 5 to 10 years in the Indian economy? Because the one thing which has really was important for an outsider as far as India was concerned, that in the last 25 years, despite all the ups and downs, Indian economy has been doing reasonably well. And that was the large attraction because India was always a democracy. India was always a big country. But now in the last 6, 7 years, and particularly now after pandemic, there are also signs that there is a less of a, I would say, confidence in the Indian economy, in the policy makers. And that is also to some extent showing into the way actually we are dealing with the outside world. We haven't signed any major trade agreement in the last couple of years with any country. At the last minute, we also moved out from RCEP. And Germany has been pushing for FTA with the EU for last many, many years. Now that also hasn't happened. So this will have not just impact on, I would say, domestic economy, but the kind of thing which the way India is going to engage with the rest of the world in the coming years. That also perhaps one has to see. So some of those issues perhaps will come back later if there's a time. So now may I invite our third panelist, Professor Dr. Till Barninghausen. He is the director of the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health and also Humboldt professor at the University of Heidelberg and senior faculty at one of the 5 global programs of the British Wellcome Trust, the Africa Health Research Institute in South Africa. His research is focused on different kind of health-related issues, and he has led more than 30 large-scale population-based and health system randomized control trials and more than 100 quasi experiments in Africa, Asia, and Europe. So, Professor Till Hausen, you have listened the Indian story, how India has kind of tackled COVID-19. But Europe and Germany was even affected much before India, so it's still continuing to be affected by this. And now you can bring the European and German story to our audience, Professor Till. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachdeva. Professor Sachdeva, I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see. Oh, it is gone now.
So my presentation is visible?
No, I think it was there, but now it is gone.
Is
At
it
least
visible now?
I can't see now. I don't know others if they can see.
Okay, I'll unshare and share again. And thank you in advance for your feedback.
Professor Till, try sharing the file directly and not the screen. Yeah.
This one?
If you go on the top
Does it
bar
work?
where it says share and then directly share the file.
Share file. Yeah, from my computer. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was visible earlier, but I don't know what happened.
It was visible. Yeah, maybe I just unshare and do what I did before. Cancel. And now I will share again. you see it?
It hasn't come yet, but yeah, it has come now.
So it's entitled National Responses to the Pandemic. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, I can
Perfect.
see that.
Thank you so much, and apologies for my technical difficulties, always learning. Yeah, so many of the wonderful comments by Professor Jain, you, Professor Sachdeva, and Professor Mukherjee really resonate with me. I will focus on the health responses, on interventions. I'm Till Bernighausen. I'm leading the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health. We are large 100 faculty research center in the medical faculty at University of Heidelberg, Germany's oldest university, 1386. And we focus on population health intervention research in trials, in quasi-experiments, but also designing novel solutions to public health issues and population health interventions. What really resonates with me is the comment you made in the beginning, Professor Sachdeva, and also Professor Mukherjee, the interaction between policymakers and technical specialists, scientists. We have a lot to contribute, and I think we have learned through the pandemic to work together even more strongly in co-creation and in a sense mutually learning. And science has, of course, a massive contribution to make here for policy, because we are the business of learning and generating new knowledge. To motivate my presentation, this is from an early study that Nikhil Sudarsanan at in Heidelberg led, where we had some of the earliest data to explore a bit the puzzlement why the case fatality ratio, the proportion of people who die given that they are tested positive for COVID-19, differed so widely across the world. And now we have that data for nearly every country in the world at the time. This is middle of last year. We had it for these countries that you see here on your screen. And you see this tenfold difference in case fatality between Italy and Germany. And we do something very simple. Nikhil Sudarsanan is a behavioral scientist, but also a demographer. So we controlled for differences in the age distribution, standardizing and adjusting for differences in the age distribution between countries and how that affects the case fatality ratio. And we see here that the difference, more than tenfold, melts to about threefold. So age could potentially explain a large proportion of these differences. So it is luck rather than the systems, but some component is probably also the concentration of intensive care wards, that you have intensive care beds and breathing support in countries which differ widely. And to me, and I think also to policymakers worldwide, the COVID-19 pandemic as a major tragedy has had a very positive effect. I think we've learned to refocus on the classics in public health functions and interventions. And I want to give examples in 3 of these domains: knowledge and motivation, a major public health opportunity, but also responsibility for public health authorities; screening and testing, very similar; and then lockdown and opening, one of the oldest public health interventions dating back to medieval and Renaissance time. Remember Leprosis islands in Italy and the Decameron, where people locked themselves down, or the affected were locked down in particular places within society to prevent the spread of an infectious disease. And most countries have the legal right, of course, to do that, and have done it in very many different ways in the COVID-19 pandemic. So starting with knowledge and motivation, here's some result from a study we did in China, where we used Kunlun data and pushed into WeChat, one of the 2 major social media platforms in China, questions about COVID-19 to assess COVID-19 knowledge. And we see here this gradient, in a sense, high knowledge in eastern provinces and then falling knowledge towards the west in China, showing the potential to target knowledge and education on COVID-19. And then we took one such intervention to the test in 5 countries: the US, Germany, UK, France, Spain, and Mexico, using a 3-minute long wordless animated video that Maya Adam at Stanford produced, and we randomized online. These are online trials, and Professor Yain said, look, COVID-19 prevented a lot of physical measurement from happening, so we lost a lot of data opportunities, but we also gained the capacity to work, of course, with satellite imagery and with online trials, not physical world trials, but trials where we recruit via online platforms participants. We randomize them here to the co-video, the intervention, wordless, animated, wonderful soundtrack, globally understandable, we think, an attention placebo control, and a pure control that didn't get anything. The attention placebo control is a completely unrelated video. And then we tested our primary endpoints here, knowledge and intervention, motivation to participate, to do the right thing in your daily lives. And we see, and that was important to know, this is June of last year, so early in the pandemic in the countries that we worked in, that nearly everybody already knew nearly everything. And this might have been expected. To us, it wasn't. We always learn as scientists. It was a positive surprise that people engaged online. It's a particular population. It's people who are online. But in Germany, the vast majority of our daily lives is now spent online. We spend more time, in fact, online than we spend offline in our waking hours, 6 or so. So we are present, and most of us are in most middle and high income countries. Low income countries are a different picture in many communities still. So we see very high knowledge attainment. There was some lack of knowledge. We could significantly, but very marginally boost knowledge. We simply had what the trialists would call a ceiling effect. We couldn't go past perfect knowledge, but where we could, we had a significant effect in this video. And we are currently testing again with Maya Adam at Stanford, who produces these videos, a 1 minute long COVID vaccine hesitancy video to give people reasons and motivation. It uses humor, it uses knowledge and facts to overcome hesitancy to to the COVID-19 vaccines. As you know, we see now in many high-income countries a leveling off. Germany, Israel, UK, US, it differs, right? The levels differ. The sort of people we can reach easily in Germany may end up being 70%. In the UK, it looks like 60%. In the States, it looks like 50%. So these levels change, but massive proportions of populations in many countries are hesitant. Some are completely unreachable and would never take the vaccine, but some could potentially be convinced. One major learning here in these online interventions is that videos need to be short. They are a wonderful, very engaging approach, because online, it's where we are, and the content that we use most online is actually videos, right? Videos is the most viewed content, and they provide education and entertainment, which are exactly the two functions that the internet provides to us. But this video is now 1 minute. We learned that some people break early. 3 minutes is already too long. 1 minute is probably better. The next domain is screening and testing. Clearly, again, a classic in public and population health. And early, again, in the pandemic, we published here a simulation study looking at the questions, how can we efficiently test? Clearly, no country in this world can screen everyone every day. So we need to potentially exploit targeting and tailoring opportunities for testing. Here we show on the left side standard mass throughput screening, on the right-hand side targeted screening that exploits the clustered nature of the pandemic. And we see that the minima are similar, but for most scenarios, clustering and prevalence, the targeted screening approach uses far fewer tests to detect one positive person. That's on the y-axis here, the axis going from low to high. How many tests do we need to find one person who is COVID positive? And then public health authorities can act. We put this to the test in a trial in Germany, funded by the National Research Network on COVID-19. And here in a cluster, 2x2 cluster, randomized controlled trial, where we stratify by 2 dimensions interactively, screening before we offer the actual test, the screening questions, and then using the clustered nature of the pandemic to steer our testing practice. And one other major learning, so clearly one of the major complaints by policymakers and public health authorities about us in science is you are too slow. Now online, we're already massively accelerated in our work. It takes a few weeks to do an online trial. It takes a few years to do an offline real-world trial. But even that time in the real world can be shrunk. And here we show the timeline. You see the calendar weeks in the middle. So from calendar week 38 to 51, that's the fastest trial I've done in the real world. We were able to carry out this testing and screening trial. And here are some early results where we see two things that are not our primary endpoints. Our primary endpoints were cost effectiveness of these different resource effectiveness in mass screening and testing, very useful for many other pandemics that may come. Here we see, first of all, only 2/3, 1/3 of people participates, maybe 2/5 if you're lucky, and the different arms in the different approaches to the testing offering are different in their participation rates. So we need to learn to engage people clearly, and we knew that, and I remember lobbying for it, and I let myself be overruled that we have more incentives, more motivation, more the knowledge we've gained over the past decade in behavioral economics. How can we ensure high participation rates? And that's the future agenda, and clearly it's a realization that is important. We are now testing alternative screening approaches in South Africa and Kenya with the European Union EDCDP. And the last domain, one of the oldest classics in public health interventions and policy is locking down and then when to open and how to open. And we very early on worked with Professor Chen Wang, with Professor Yang at Peking Union Medical College, China's best medical university, when the pandemic started to go from China to global, and wrote about it in the Lancet, describing the initial Chinese responses. And then we described one particular innovation that Professor Chen Wang led, who in a sense organized the initial public health response in Wuhan, driving down from Beijing, assembling a team, and now searching frantically as a pneumologist, a specialist in pneumology, for an ideal solution to many of the public health challenges in the emerging situation in Wuhan. And he invented, standing on the shoulder of giants in public health, Fangzang shelter hospitals, these centers where social spaces were reconverted to become isolation facilities for people with mild and moderate infections. And we described how they worked and what functions they fulfilled in the Lancet early on in the epidemic last year. And some countries went this way. Others had similar approaches, US, UK, but it was more in Asia that these approaches, in a sense, community isolation, not family isolation, were implemented at scale and as major national policies. Here's the situation in Wuhan. These are the Fangzang shelter hospitals that were very quickly erected. They serve mainly an isolation function, but also a constant screening and rapid referral function for patients. And here you see the numbers. Above the x-axis, you see the capacity of beds. The little blue chart are the numbers of people in Fangzang shelter hospitals. And below, you see the discharge, which could either be in the community because the infectiveness had passed and people could be safely, for their own health, but also for transmission, released into the community, or referral to a higher level hospital where breathing support and intensive care and complex medical care were available. And we think, based on modeling that we did and published in Engineering, Simiao Chen led this research, that this intervention, the Chinese lockdown, and within it the Fangzang shelter hospitals, bought China and the world time, but it didn't prevent, in the end, the massive surge in the pandemic. And had China acted even earlier, we would have seen massively stronger effects. So it is about speed, and that's a major lesson learned for the world. When something happens, you have to be fast. A few days can really make a major difference. You see here the difference in the epidemic trajectories depending on how quickly and how long the lockdown was implemented. And we also think we can learn from each other, and we shouldn't give up on multilateral hopes and ideas. And here's a modeling that we did how the US might have fared had we implemented functional shelter hospitals, i.e. community isolation, not family isolation. Family isolation is problematic because of transmission within families. If you're in a community isolation, which may not be cultural or politically doable, but you are not transmitting to an uninfected person, and especially not to a family member, right? So in some sense, family isolation, home isolation is cruel because you put your most loved ones at most risk. Community isolation may be attractive for that reason, and it is certainly likely to be effective if applied at mass scale. We also see here that high capacity helps and rapid testing while this offering is made helps. My last example from Germany. So a major public debate in Germany is once you have lockdown, how do you reopen? Who infects whom? And we did the last to date, I think, in my overview of the literature, the largest school and kindergarten-based study on COVID transmission with public health authority in one of the German states, Rhineland-Palatinate, and 60,000 students and teachers tested. You see the following picture emerging here. The thickness of the arrows that you see shows transmission events that we recorded. These are proven transmissions. And the large figures are teachers, the small ones with a balloon are children. And you see here who transmits to whom. And it is intuitive once we see this more differentiated knowledge. But we need to show it, right? First of all, teachers do not transmit to children in schools, but they do transmit to children in daycare. Simply very plausible because they are handling children, they're close, they're hugging children, they're placing in school. It is possible to isolate teachers and children far enough. There's no physical contact on an ongoing basis, so transmission does not happen in schools in the German context. And children do not infect teachers, period. So in neither the kindergarten setting nor in the school setting did we find significant numbers of children to teacher transmission. And this made the headlines in our major tabloid in Germany, the Bild Zeitung. And then finally, to wrap up, a few thoughts about India. So sadly, in our portfolio thus far, we've worked in Africa, in China, in Europe, in the US, but we haven't really worked on interventions in India. We would love to do so, and if one of you is interested, please contact me. But we do work in India with the Indian Institute of Public Health, often using Indian household surveys. And here a PhD student of mine, a former PhD student, Pascal Geldsetzer, who is now a professor at Stanford, and a large team that we assembled of Indian and global colleagues looked at the gradient of diabetes and hypertension in India. You see these massive regional differences emerging here in the prevalence of diabetes. Diabetes was an early risk factor in the pandemic and would seem to be a very plausible risk factor for bad outcomes, suffering after a COVID-19 infection, mortality, morbidity, long COVID. And diabetes, of course, reduces immune system function. So it's highly plausible that that is the case. We've also shown another former PhD student of mine, Chen Mangola, who is now a professor at Harvard, how the global cascade in serving patients in low and middle income countries who have diabetes, we are failing them essentially, and few people achieve blood sugar control that will prevent bad long outcomes. But also in a syndemic lens, the syndemic of COVID is really BMI, probably diabetes and lung function, people who are already in certain age groups and thus suffer those conditions. High BMI, diabetes, reduced lung functions, chronic pulmonary obstructive disease are at high risk of fatal outcomes. So the syndemic approach is important, likely. We now think, for some reason, evidence seems to be emerging, it's still early days, that it is actually BMI itself and maybe not that much via diabetes, but we will have to see once more and better studies are coming out. So maybe BMI is the major factor driving these high risk of bad outcomes from COVID scenarios. here, and we just published that 2 weeks ago in The Lancet, a PhD student of mine, Felix Teufel, where we looked globally at this old relationship between body mass index and diabetes. The bigger we are in our body mass, the more likely we are to suffer from diabetes. But what is novel here, and that is known, what is novel here is that this linear relationship that we see between body mass and diabetes differs widely across countries, and it may be very different in Asia versus Europe versus Africa. And that's important. So we might need to very early intervene in some, or much earlier than we currently do, when people gain body mass in some continents than in others. So in summary, I think population health intervention research is one of those technical domains where policymakers and practitioners, public health authorities can benefit. We can make a contribution. This is important. We have learned to remember the classics in public health through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've also learned that this collaboration with public health authorities and policymakers is possible. It is hard, and we can do better. And co-creation capacity can be boosted. Syndemics are likely to matter. And finally, context, country, culture, creed will matter. But we can learn from each other, and we should, and not give up on multilateral learning, at least in science, at least in the technological spheres, but moving into policy and practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Till. And I think it was a very fascinating set of data, and all the experiments you have shown us. But if I just ask, actually, start with you. I mean, before we have we open up for general discussion. Since you have worked on cross-country kind of, different kind of the way pandemic has been tackled by different policymakers in different countries. Now, if one look back now, initially when the whole thing started in China, and then later on mainly went to Europe, and you have all the stories from Italy and UK and other countries. And by the time it came to India, from Russia, Turkey, etc., when all those countries already affected, so there was relatively, I would say, sufficient knowledge was available to some extent how to deal with the initially. But of course, I mean, now we know much more than what we knew at that point of time. Yeah. But still, by that time, I think there were two rough models were kind of being discussed. One was the way the Chinese handled, which is again, even till today, the whole thing started there, but they have been able to contain it, in whatever weather. So one model people were talking at that point of time that you have to have strict lockdowns and all those kind of things. So the way Chinese were able to do it. And then if you look at all the initial responses, from UK to Germany to Spain to all other countries in Europe, so they were trying that we have to live with this virus and all the herd immunity and all those kind of arguments. Yeah. Later on, of course, they also went with many lockdowns when things went out of hand. But by the time it came to India, I think we are a couple of months late, but still India went with strict lockdowns, right? I mean, knowing the fact that actually we had very limited number of infections by then, and then later on it just opened up, so is there any, why, I mean, the question really is that do we know enough how to handle it? Because still, we do have infections despite all the vaccinations. And then later on, when it went to the US, I mean, it went in a different way altogether. So how, why different countries, why this kind of knowledge sharing or understanding did not happen, and why Chinese were still very successful till today? I mean,
so a few comments. Wonderful question, and very deep, and it's something we will wrangle with and continue to learn from the recent past. I think at least into the next year or so. There are many studies looking at these questions, but one observation, it was a global phenomenon, and the learning from each other is astonishingly lacking. And this is not particular to any particular nation. I'll give the example from Europe. Italy was far ahead of Germany. Germany was far ahead of the UK. The pandemic went Italy, Germany, UK. And maybe with a difference of a few weeks in the pandemic, in the epidemic trajectories. across these nations. And Germany could have learned better from Italy, and the UK could have learned more from Italy and Germany. And I think there are functions in public health learning and really doing this research fast and quick, right? So we cannot really blame only the policymakers. Science has to be very fast. And also the functions of transmitting knowledge and lobbying for certain approaches is not strongly enough in existence currently. The European CDC had a role to play and did that, but I think it should be strengthened to be such a knowledge platform and passive repository, but also active engager on knowledge, best practices, and so forth. The second observation is the later phases in the pandemic showed similar lost opportunities. Germany had a very mild first and second phase, and then we had time to prepare, and the third wave hit us hard, and it is a failure not to have learned, and we had months of time to put actions into place and policies to prevent the third phase, and that didn't happen, and we'll have to find out why. So almost all countries, I think, have some example where they could have learned faster from their own past actions, and even earlier, when a pandemic spreads throughout the world, we can learn from each other, and we should do so more systematically, and India is an important example. The second major point is that, of course, this learning is constrained by context. Cultures differ, and what is politically doable, state capacity, state control differs. And the government saying we're locking down doesn't mean the lockdown will happen. That depends critically on the implementation state capacity that a country has. So what works in China may not work in India, simply because there are different political regimes, the institutions differ, and the way countries are maybe divided or not divided. So these deep factors that make us different across countries are relevant for things such as lockdown, information and motivation. These are culturally and contextually determined factors. So it will not be one size fits all. We can learn from each other, probably at the level of the evidence that I've shown, at the level of the intervention. But then the intervention certainly needs to be adapted, and it needs to be feasible in a local context and effective in a local context. There's no guarantee that it will be. Unlike medicine, biology, our knowledge in medicine is near universal what biology is concerned, but is very context specific what behavioral interventions and public health interventions are concerned, behavioral and structural interventions. And that's important to take into account. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up too harshly if something that has worked in a country is transplanted into another context, doesn't work. We need this new knowledge, and the transportability of effects is not guaranteed, and we need to boost our capacity to transport meaningfully. And that includes design research and quantitative transportation studies, transportability studies.
And just very brief, brief follow-up. I mean, so if now you look back, what major mistake do you think the Europe did and India did, which they shouldn't have done? I mean, while looking at, hindsight or what, at that point of time, they may not have that knowledge or understanding, but still now you see that if they wouldn't have done this, maybe we would have been in a better place today.
Yeah, I think in many European countries invest massively more than we did, not in structures and necessarily lockdowns, but in providing knowledge and motivating people to adhere to advice and, in a sense, even state mandates. So people do not follow those advices, and depending on how your society is structured, we need people to buy in. And we know that often the voluntary participation rates are higher than the mandated ones. Yeah. So we might have adverse effects of mandating, forcing people to behave in a certain way. Really powerful example from German history in that respect is the Nazi regime that had totalitarian control of its population and nevertheless decided to make vaccinations a individual and family choice. So vaccinations under the Nazis were not mandated, and the Nazis didn't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They could have enforced it by their totalitarian power, but they estimated that with good propaganda, they would get higher vaccination rates. And they were probably right, because during the Nazi regime, vaccination rates were near universal, but families could opt out and decide against. It's a powerful historic example in Germany, one of the most inhumane and totalitarian regimes in the history of this world, taking such a decision. So the understanding that governments needs to have how to successfully provide knowledge, motivation, and influence populations in doing the right thing. I think it's really important. We are not understanding it at mass level. We understand it from research in psychological laboratories, but we don't understand it in populations in many countries in this world. What motivates people, and we are struggling, many societies, with social divisions, and COVID-19 is a part of those divisions. We have the vaccine deniers really encouraged and motivated now, fighting this government idea that you should be vaccinated, and pushing their individual freedoms and rights in a democracy not to be vaccinated. We need to reach them in other ways, and that's hard. And many countries lack understanding. I also think, comparing to Africa, that Europe was surprised by how inexperienced in some classic public health functions its own systems fail. In Africa, due to HIV and mass testing in community, there's an infrastructure with community health workers and constant contacts with households that doesn't exist in Germany in the same way. So the reach into where people live and go to school and play is stronger in other countries, and Europe can learn here from countries that have very strong community health responses historically, from Alma-Ata and so forth, but also recently in the pandemic response to the pandemic of the past decade, the HIV pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Professor Rahul Mukherjee, I mean, if you can hear me, Mr. Rahul?
Yeah, can hear you.
Oh, yeah. So, Rahul, I mean, one is you live in Germany and you have followed very closely what's happening in India and your presentation. What major difference do you really find in the Indian approach and the German approach, which is, this is what we are discussing here. And the second thing, I mean, the point you made, I mean, about centralization of the government and government using COVID-19 to do many things, which but the government, why they needed COVID-19? Because they had brute majority anyway in parliament, so they could have done many things otherwise. Why they actually resort to doing things under the garb of COVID-19? If you could just answer one of these.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the fact that I am following India in my publications, but living in Germany is an eye opener. And I think Till is absolutely right that we have in Germany not a perfect strategy. But the problem with India has been that the extent to which knowledge was discarded is just too significant for any kind of understanding of good governance. So, for example, let's look at the period between January and the 24th of March, 2021. During this period, the virus had penetrated the state of Kerala. Kerala did a fairly good job of dealing with that virus. In fact, during that period, it was spectacular. And the Kerala lesson could easily have been learned. I mean, just like countries can learn from each other, states in India can also learn from each other. And Kerala had actually like Germany, Kerala had a very strong public health infrastructure. And I think the public health infrastructure is very, very important. I mean, the amount Germany spent to save every life is something that is amazing. I have doctors who've told me that it's, many countries can't save that kind of, those many lives, because, if you have to put a patient into an ECMO machine, which will lead to a charge of 300,000 euros. That is the amount you pay for buying a house in the neighborhood of Heidelberg. And the government in Germany actually put in that kind of money. I have a friend in France who told me that a lot of the French, until I disagree with this because his sort of knowledge is less anecdotal and more scientific. He said that one of the things that the Germans did and the French did not was that they corporatized their health system. And the corporatization of the health system may have, both in France and in Britain, produced a much lesser ability to deal with a crisis. I mean, when you don't have a crisis, you can deal with the situation. Whereas Germany had the depth. It had so much depth that without bragging about its health infrastructure, you came to know how strong it was. Not because, Germans were very obedient, certainly not. That was not the strong point of Germany. But that the economy was strong, the health infrastructure was strong, and by and large, even with a population, which as still pointed out, was quite restless and not very obedient, over the longer during, the results are pretty much better than most other countries in the world. And that is something I can vouch for. Having, I was in India from the 12th of March to the 12th of February when my father died, till the 31st of March. And before that, I was in Germany. And after that, I came back to Germany. And from the 7th of April, horror struck in Delhi. So the point I'm trying to make is that I think one of the critical differences between, let's say, a country like India and a country like Germany in a ceteris paribus condition, which is, let us assume that we control for differences in resources, is, I think, the fundamental disrespect for technical knowledge. And I will just give you two examples. There were two articles in the Indian Journal of Medical Research written by fairly powerful people in the Indian Council of Medical Research, whose director actually became very close to the political dispensation and subsequently started touting that the vaccine that had not been tested will be available from the 15th of August this year. Those articles had argued systematically that the lockdown has to be a far more community-driven effort, and that if you did not do that, India would just not be able to sustain, given its levels of poverty and given its... But India can do these things at a community level, because, the community-based idea works in India. That message was completely ignored. I mean, I can give you some confidential evidence. I had to talk to a person who was within the Indian Council of Medical Research. And the person who connected me with that person said that, do you have signal? And in those days, I thought signal was an internet connection. So I said, yes, certainly I do have signal. I can make a WhatsApp call, I can make a direct call. He said, no, do you have signal? So the Indian Council of Medical Research establishment, which had contrarian views, was working like the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, from where scientists could not actually even say what they felt like saying if it were contrary to opinion. So I think this inability of the government, a former health secretary told me that India has vaccinated, record populations. If the Ministry of Health had been consulted properly, this kind of a fiasco would not have occurred. Most of the governance actually happened with the help of half a dozen secretaries sitting around the Prime Minister, ignoring the Ministry of Health. So I think the fundamental problem is a problem of governance, which I stated, and we are doing more research along these lines. I have a paper in the Journal of Democracy which brings out some of these issues in its earlier manifestations. And I think that's where a lot of the problem lies in India. I mean, there is fair amount of technical capacity. I mean, those scientists in the ICMR can certainly connect with Till and do fascinating work to understand science and context. India has produced Nobel laureates in economics. So, that is not a problem. I think the fundamental problem is that India has lost its ability to receive and use technical advice, something in which it was very, very good. I mean, look at the way in which Dr. Manmohan Singh performed the reforms of 1991. A country goes to the IMF and it often has sudden death. But Indian technocrats had such a smart plan that it led to something called homegrown conditionality. But if you fail to take technical advice, I think you are in grave danger. And some of those dangers have just been pointed out in great detail by Tim. And what was your second question? The question of the political.
Briefly, if you could answer, because time is very limited.
Quickly, I would say that I will not argue that the propensities that are producing what now comparative politics scholars call competitive authoritarianism are connected at source with COVID-19. I will certainly not make that argument. Abrogation of Article 370, the Citizenship Amendment Act, all of these precede, and we are doing some systematic work on this. But the COVID-19 shock is something like an exogenous shock that can spur certain tendencies. And the manner in which these tendencies get spurred are manifested in the way in which the parliament is behaving. So March 24, 2020, parliament is shut down. Electoral bonds are announced soon there. The Prime Minister cares is announced soon thereafter. There is so much debate in the public sphere on PM cares, but none of that happened in the parliament. Because the parliament was simply not there to judge whether or not a country that has the Prime Minister's Relief Fund should have something else called PM cares. Similarly, if you look at the way in which the FCRA 2020 was passed, now FCRA 2020 is something that probably many Indians haven't heard about. But if you are a civil society organization trying to do some work which is contrarian, it's going to be very difficult for you. It is not the death of civil society in India. That's why I call it drift. It's not a conversion, but it is a significant movement in controlling. And how was the FCRA of 2020 amended? Just look at that. The farmers' bills. I mean, the farmers' bills led to such a furor because of a voice bill. When you have majority in the parliament, you don't take a voice vote, right? Because, as you said, the brute majority was always already there. But some of these issues are so explosive that even with the brute majority, getting things done wouldn't have been easier. And I'll just tell you two things about parliamentary procedure. A voice vote must proceed with a majority that agrees to a voice vote in the parliament. A voice vote in the parliament is never taken after the duration of the parliament is over. In this case, the voice vote was taken after the parliamentary duration was over, in a manner in which the speaker actually judged why the voice vote should win. Now, if the government was so confident about the voice vote, with all the majority that it has, which actually led to the resignation of a cabinet minister of agriculture, then the voice vote should not have been required. Now, all of these propensities are somewhat spurred by the fact that you have a virus, that you have fewer hours of working time, and that you want to get a lot of work done. But certainly that is not moving in the direction of deliberations. So I completely agree with you that a lot of the work could have been done and would probably have been done, but, physicists call it acceleration. You have velocity and then you have acceleration. And sometimes an exogenous shock accelerates certain propensities. But certainly the push was always there.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Now, in fact, I'll we have a limited time, but we can stretch a couple of more minutes, I guess. We are in India, not in Germany. So, Professor Jain, the questions which I raised earlier about what's happening in agriculture in the Indian economy, and also the inequality part. Could you would like to comment on those issues before we go on?
Sure. I think what you said, that agriculture sector has done well, that's basically a comment about production, but it's not a comment about supply chain or markets, right? So yes, there is agricultural productivity on the production side of things on the farm, but the disruptions have been on the supply chains, both on inputs as well as outputs. And so, in that sense, if farmers cannot take their produce to market or get a fair price, you will see that the 60% of the population that is directly linked to the farm sector will be suffering. And so that's why, you see an increase in hunger, and an increase in rural, poverty as a result of all this. The second point about inequality, the reason why inequality is increasing is because the poor are doing worse, right? The stock market is doing well, not because of inherent productivity of the firms, it's because of liquidity provided by the RBI in response to the pandemic, right? So the Reserve Bank of India has injected a large amount of liquidity, correctly so, in order to buffer Indian firms, Indian financial firms, etc., at a time where the counterfactual where the RBI also reduced liquidity would have been a major problem. So some of that liquidity goes into purchasing stocks. Some of those stocks are owned by the wealthiest people, and so that's why you see some of those people do well. It has nothing to do with the inherent productivity; it's to do with liquidity, right? So in that sense, the reason why I'd be concerned about inequality is not because the rich are doing better. Essentially they're not. It's because the poor are doing a lot worse. And so I think that's now to some extent these are addressable problems, right? So for example, tomorrow you can repair some supply chains. Tomorrow you can, markets will be functioning again. I think the places where I'm really concerned about is things like education, where you see that for a year and a half kids have been out of school, and you can think about the long-term effects of not being in school for a whole generation, right? So this is a whole generation of kids. The kids who are in school today are the largest cohorts ever in human history. So the set of kids who are in school right now in India are the largest classes ever in any country ever in human history, and those are the kids who are out of school for almost a year and a half. So what are the learning losses associated with that? I think there's just been a report out there today, which is basically saying that online school, no one learned anything. Most of the kids didn't have devices. When they did have devices, most of them were just wasting their time. So the consequences of that will not be fixed by fixing markets tomorrow. The consequences of that will be faced for many decades to come while these kids sort of live their lives out. They didn't learn at a critical period of their time, and therefore they grew up to be less productive adults. And so, I think those will be pretty severe consequences.
Thank you, Professor Jain. Now we have finished our time, but still, I don't see any question in the chat box. At least I can't see it. But if we have now about 35 participants here, if there is anybody, any comment, any question, or any query, we have another 5-7 minutes to kind of wrap up this discussion. Any question, you can raise your hand or you can ask put in the chat box. No. Yeah, at least I can't see anything. No hand raised or no other question. So if that is the case, then what we can do is we have, we had very rich discussion on this issue on pandemic. Obviously, different countries are dealing this pandemic in a different way. And there are lessons to be learned. Some lessons have been learned, but some lessons still countries refuse to learn, and still the knowledge is. But now, in fact, I'm told by the people, those who are expert about the medical field, that at least about 80% knowledge about COVID is now available. I do not know to what extent this is true. So with that knowledge, at least now at least some vaccination has started happening. So hopefully, in the next couple of months, things would be under control. But already, as we have seen, there is already huge impact on the economies, on the societies. And the other point which we really did not discuss or touch in a very serious way is about how this is going to impact the global order, or how this is going to impact the global situation, which of course this is affecting. I mean, we can see clearly the way China is asserting, the way global institutions, from WHO, WTA, all of them, they're playing a very different kind of role, or they're not very effective in many ways. So the impact of this is still unfolding, as I said in the beginning, but we know where the direction is. And clearly there is and I think with all the conversations which we had today, there is a clear scope for learning from each other. And here we are, talking about India, Germany, or India, Europe. And I think, since the convergence are happening on many other areas, and this is one area, particularly post-COVID economic recovery, and also the health implications, or the way we need to be tackling this. Of course, the situation and environments are very, very different. So there are plenty of areas, plenty of scopes to kind of work in these areas. So we have learned quite a lot, I think, today, and many more things we can continue to discuss maybe in some other session later on, particularly on the global issues and how this is going to have the order, of course, is changing. We have seen very close now the way American forces have moved out from Afghanistan, and that's created a new mess in South Asia now. The whole area is going to be tackling this for the next many, many years, I hope. So let's see how things happen. So over to you now to the director or to the organizer, whoever wants to take over. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you all the panelists and everyone who has participated very patiently and listening to all these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sachdeva, for the moderation. Thanks to the panelists for this insights in different fields on policies. I think we had quite a ride in this session, from public health to vaccine policies, economics, but I think we had a nice bracket, and we brought the ideas well together and had a good look into the ongoing policies and responses in India and Germany. So thanks so much for that session. Now it's up to me to close today, and I could say, yes, it was an interesting symposium. We had tackled a lot of topics, and if I look back at the day, so what are my takeaways? I've learned today that it's social media and WhatsApp which is playing a major role, be it in misinformation, be it in teaching in schools, or be it the WeChat data Mr. Berninghausen used for collecting data on health policies in China and taking on forwards learning on COVID. We discussed that responses can not just be in online spaces taking place. And I think that's true for public health, but especially for media. And it might not be alone enough to take responses online to deal with misinformation. We had very good insight that there are actions to be taken also from civil society and on-site. And I think that holds true for all the discussions we have. We have a need for a diverse research framework, be it in misinformation, but be it also in governance, in public health, in economics, and so on. And we need to understand the larger ecosystems. That was what we heard in the first session. My understanding from the second session was it's not just the ecosystems in a larger setup of a society. It's also we need to understand the circumstances a person is learning in. It's not just about technology. So one needs to have an understanding and have to always have a look from different perspective on things. And I think that's what we did today in this today's symposium. A takeaway is also there needs to take place an intensive discussion between scientists and policymakers, and policy can't be made without the scientists and with evidence from science. And I think we saw in the presentation of Professor Mukherjee that what can happen if one hides data, one is not taking data into consideration, and we've seen that also in India, but also in Germany. Surprisingly, I learned that there's a huge lack of learning from each other, be it in states in India or between states in Germany, but also on international level. I personally thought there would have been more done, but I think it's a learning that there needs to be. We need to bridge the gap and learn from each other. And I think with the symposium today, we did also a step in that direction to share opinions regards. Of course, we also have them to take them to the policy level. It doesn't help if the discussion stays in the science circles. I think it's a bit the takeaway. If I look at the three panels, of course, we had very intensive discussions on different topics, reaching from economics, going to public health, discussing about agriculture, digital learning in German universities, but also discussing how we can make work from home better and what we should take care, but also what is needed to fight against misinformation, which then also leads again back to the last panel to hesitance in vaccines and so on. I think a very, very interesting day. So thanks to all the speakers of today. Thanks to all the institutions who helped organizing in the back. We named them at the beginning. So that was the DBH supporters who contributed substantially to this event today with their thoughts, with their discussions, also with their suggestions for speakers. So thanks to our supporters again for this event. I would leave it here, and then the last word is from Adishri, who opened the event and who has also the last word for closing the event.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot. Katja, I would like to just close here by saying that we will still continue our discussions on the discourse of the topic. This was not the last one for this year. In December comes up the next event, beginning of December, where we will speak about pandemics and equity. So the information will be soon up. And if you would like to learn a little bit more on what's going on in terms of the geopolitics and the general discourse of the topic in India and Germany, a newsletter on the topic is going to be out end of this month together with a couple of institutions from India and Germany. So a link has been dropped in the chat window. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletters or infomailing, please do that. There will be special articles up for reads end of the month. And then with that, I would also close the day. Thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of this, speakers, audience, supporters. Thanks a lot for all your effort here. Have a good day and take care, everybody. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.